to all the members of this fraternity, our chairperson, Professor Mrinal Srivastava, Professor Rajendra Chenni, our resource person, all the research scholars and all the attendees. कि तोड़ना है हर पिंजरा मेरी उड़ान अभी बाकी है मंजिलें जमी भर नहीं आसमान अभी बाकी है लहरों का थमना नहीं समंदर की बेबसी बाहर खामोशी से ही भीतर कई तूफान अभी बाकी है Indeed, ISPEL has spread its wings in many countries and its light is all prevailing. ISPEL, which is established with a motto, facilitate to elevate the taste and bliss in the field of English language and literature, was inaugurated on 5th September 2020. And in this short span of 1 month, we had attended 6 wonderful and learning events that opened the new horizons of knowledge. And now we are ready for another great event on why should we read Shakespeare today. It is worth noting that while Shakespeare is required in the Common Core High School English Language Arts standards, it is the case that most of the country's top-ranked colleges and universities don't require English majors to take a course devoted to Shakespeare works. Many of the teachers argue that the students should not have to read Shakespeare because other literature better speaks to the needs of ethnically diverse and wonderfully curious modern-day students. Further, it might be appropriate to acknowledge Shakespeare as a chronicler of life as he saw it 450 years ago. So now question arises. What Shakespeare wrote 450 years ago is not applicable to our teaching today? Ethnically diverse students don't foolishly fall in love and over-dramatize every facet of that experience, or feel jealousy or rage, or feel victim to discrimination, or act desperately out of passion. To dismiss Shakespeare on the grounds that life 450 years ago has no relation to life today is to dismiss every religious text, every piece of ancient mythology, Greek, African, Native American, etc. And for that matter, everything that was not written in whatever time defined is now. Shakespeare is more than just a long dead British guy, and I believe he has much to teach us about the modern human condition. That is why Ben Jonson praised him and said, Shakespeare is not of an age, but for all time. Shakespeare is a big part of history that is still popular after 450 years. His truly great characters, his tragic heroes, his remarkable storytelling, whether it's comedy, it's tragedy, it's history, melodrama, adventure, love stories, or fairy tales. Each of them was so well that they have become immortal. Shakespeare's stories transcend time and culture. He has shaped the way we read and write and will continue to do so on. Many songs and movies have referenced Shakespeare in their works. The most important reason that why we should keep reading Shakespeare is because it has a huge influence on the English language we use today. For example, the metaphors and idioms which are used, like all that glitters is not gold, is taken from the Merchant of Venice. If we don't keep reading Shakespeare and his works, we will miss the examples of how the language has evolved. Now, those who say that Shakespeare is outdated, irrelevant, and difficult, and those who have the impressions of no Shakespeare will come to know Shakespeare through the discourse by our resource person, Professor Rajendra Chenni. Professor Rajendra Chenni, formerly Professor of English, Kuvempu University, is presently Director of Manasa Center for Cultural Studies, Shivamogga. He obtained his educational qualifications from Karnataka, Dharwad, winning the gold medal for English and Armando Menezes and Beichwol awards for distinction. He joined the teaching profession in 1976 and he received his PhD degree from University of Mysore. Professor Chenni served first as reader and then as professor and chairman, postgraduate department of English Kuvempu University. He was chairman, board of studies in English, dean of arts faculty, director, school of languages. He served on several committees assisting the administration of the university. He guided 8 candidates in the MPhil program and 10 students have been awarded PhD under his supervision. Professor Chenni is an eminent bilingual writer, writing both in Kannada and English. He has authored 12 books in Kannada, 4 in English, including a novel. His contribution to Kannada literature has been honored with several awards. He has received the Karnataka Sahitya Academy Book Award twice and the Academy's Lifetime Achievement Award. He has also received the prestigious award G.S. Shivarudrappa Award, Professor V.M. Inamdar Award for Literary Criticism, B.H. Sridhara Award for Literature, and Vardhaman Udyanmukh Award for Criticism. In 2014, he was nominated as president of the Dharwad District Sahitya Sammelan. He delivered lectures at several leading institutions of Delhi, Chennai, Hyderabad, Pune, Kolkata, IIT Kharagpur, etc. So we are pleased to have Mr. Rajendra Chenni with us. You are welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harpreet Kaur. Should I begin now?
Yes, sir.
Let me first thank the host institution for extending this invitation to me to talk to you about the relevance of Shakespeare today. And I'm especially grateful to Sri Ghansham, who got in touch with me and then made a request that I should participate in the program today. And I'm also very grateful to Dr. Harpreet Kaur, not only for introducing me, but also for introducing the theme of my presentation. She raised a very important question about the two different categories of arguments regarding the contemporary relevance of Shakespeare. On the one hand, we have a group of scholars and even practitioners of theatre who feel that Shakespeare may no longer have the relevance that he has enjoyed since he wrote his plays in the late 16th and the early 17th century. And there is another category of scholars and readers who feel that Shakespeare should continue to be read in what is known as the Universalist Framework, where we treat Shakespeare as one of the greatest geniuses in the literary field, who was able to quote the old saying, hold up a mirror to human nature. And in this statement, human nature is also considered as something which is unchanging, which is not time-bound, which can be treated as a historical and a political. So there are these two very different responses to the role and place of Shakespeare in the contemporary world. What I intend to do in my presentation is to briefly go back to the arrival of Shakespeare in India and try to see if there are any lessons to learn from at least 3 of the very variegated responses which were offered to the plays of Shakespeare in India from the last few decades of the 18th century. And in the second part of my presentation, I would like to look at what happened to Shakespeare from the period of the 1950s and the 1960s, the period which is generally associated with post-coloniality and the entry of a large number of erstwhile colonial societies into the modern world of democracy. Um, the third thing I plan to do in my presentation is to go beyond these two paradigms of treating Shakespeare as a universal genius who can be interpreted and read without specific reference to the early modern Europe of which he was a part, and the other paradigm which tries to in the look for metaphors, images, and motifs which allow us to appropriate Shakespeare in order to respond to what is so historically specific about our own conditions today. It has been the consensus opinion of most historians and critics that William Shakespeare has had the longest association with India, in the sense outside his own country, England. Probably Shakespeare has had a continuous reception in India, because it all began during the early colonial period, when the expatriates in the cultural capital of India, Kolkata, decided to initiate the theater as a means of entertainment for the administrators, for the expatriates, for the sailors and the soldiers, who wanted in the first place, maybe nostalgically, to reconnect themselves to British culture through theater and drama. And then there was also this requirement of the civil society that apart from the imperial regime and then the tasks which the regime enforced on all these expatriate administrators and officers, to keep in touch with the culture of the mother country, as it were. So we find that as early as the 1770s, theaters were created in Kolkata, but these were performing spaces exclusively for the British expatriates. Even the native elites belonging to highly cultured families in Kolkata and Bengal did not become a part of the audience for a very long time. As early as 1775 and 1780, these theaters were constructed in Kolkata. You have the Kolkata Theatre and then the Chauringi Theatre and many more. Now, what happened in these theatrical spaces with reference to Shakespeare was Shakespeare's plays were frequently performed here by the expatriate actors themselves, and also by some of the traveling troops which were specially invited by the imperial regime. We are all familiar with the celebrated episode of the great British theatrical actor David Garrick, not only sending a theatrical expert to Kolkata, but also helping the theatre in Kolkata with sceneries and much of the paraphernalia you need in order to perform Shakespeare. So this was the early arrival of Shakespeare in colonial India, but this was a Shakespeare who was made available exclusively to the white British expatriates, and gradually over decades, some of the representatives of the Bhadralok, the upper caste and upper middle class and aristocratic dwellers of Calcutta from the ancient families, were also invited to join in. Now, what was the motivation behind especially performing Shakespeare for an expatriate audience here in Calcutta? I think one of the correct conjectures which have been made by the critics is to assume that Shakespeare by then had already achieved an iconic status in the canonical tradition of British literature. I'll later be commenting upon the very curious fact that the study of English literature was first introduced in the colleges and universities of India many years before it was introduced as a discipline of study in Oxford and Cambridge and other British universities. It happened first in India. Now, one of the reasons was that by then Shakespeare had already accumulated this vast reputation as probably the finest representative of British civilization and culture. You could also read British as Western. And it was necessary for the imperial masters in India to justify their presence here by arguing that colonialism was a project of civilizing the colonial subjects and introducing them to the fruits of a very progressive and humanistic culture called British culture. And the best way they thought this could be done was by introducing Shakespearean plays. And this was also the reputation before the expatriates who came together to perform the plays of Shakespeare. But very soon, the attraction of the theatrical performances spread into the other sections, not only in Calcutta, but also in Bombay. For example, in the same decade in Bombay, we had the garrison theaters where it was the soldiers and the sailors who came together to perform English plays, especially Shakespeare. So we are looking at this unusual phenomenon of theater becoming a part of the civil society. Though the motivations were somewhat different for the expatriates, this led to the creation of the indigenous theaters in India. We all know that there has been a very long and rich tradition of drama and theater in India, both in by way of the mainstream Sanskrit drama and Sanskrit theater, but also by way of the folk performing theatrical arts which were scattered throughout India. But the idea of a modern theater, the idea of performing plays which had something to do with realism, though not wholly when you come to Shakespeare, it was something very novel and very interesting, attractive to the Indian society, and that led to the birth of the Bengali theatre and then later to many different versions of the Indian theatre. Now, what happened was that in this domain also, we looked at the highly circumscribed and limited sphere of the expatriate theatre in India performing Shakespeare. We now move on to the rudimentary beginnings of the Indian theatre, which had to now confront itself and maybe in a way energize itself by drawing on these three resources which were now available. One was British drama through Shakespeare. The other was the introduction of the other playwrights, also in the English language. And then thirdly, there was this rediscovery of the indigenous theatrical traditions. Now, out of the hybrid mix of these three, a very vibrant theatre was created, and this theatre also made use of Shakespeare. But something else was also happening at the same time, and that I think is probably the most influential factor which made Shakespeare so much of an icon of the imperial culture and made him a part of the pedagogy, the teaching and the learning here in India. I am referring here to the creation of the institutions of higher education in India. At a private level, many schools had already started teaching, and they were using the medium of English. And as one can expect, William Shakespeare was a staple diet when it came to what was taught to the students of that period. This was accompanied by a paradigm shift in the educational policy of the British in India. Long before Macaulay wrote his famous, or if you prefer, notorious minutes on education in India, there had already been attempts to pressurize the imperial regime to introduce Western education through the English medium. And the pressure came from two very different groups. One was the utilitarian progressive group in England, which wanted the British imperial regime in India to give opportunities to the subject people, namely Indians, to civilize themselves by learning from British culture. And therefore, there was pressure that, unlike what the colonial regime had done earlier, that is, following a policy of total non-intervention when it came to the medium of instruction and educational policies, we enter into a phase where the British regime decides that the best thing that can be given to the indigenous and the native people would be English education, Western model of education, and the medium would be English. And with this, we enter into a period where there is a very powerful universal policy of education. And the other propelling force I did not mention was the Christian missionaries, who also believed that the British regime was not performing its responsibility or its duties by not allowing the native subjects to learn from far superior culture and civilization. And the Christian missionary groups also insisted that there should be a space created in Indian education for the encounter with the best that has been written in the English language. And then, of course, there was the advocacy of a similar kind from the leaders of the Indian elite, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy. I don't think I should go into further details. I'm only re-narrating some of the familiar aspects of our colonial history. So this meant that English literature, as especially represented by its canonical writer Shakespeare, would be introduced in the Indian educational system as the literature which was a repository of all humanistic values, and the literature which was far superior to the more ancient literatures, not only in Sanskrit but also in our indigenous languages or bhashas. From this point onwards, Shakespeare has been right at the center of all our pedagogical enterprises. So, though the avowed and declared purpose of the British regime was to prepare a class of people, educated people, who would be Hindus or Indians in blood, but would have a sensibility shaped by English language and British culture. It was Shakespeare who was introduced. I hope you are able to see the contradiction here in this policy decision. You are planning to prepare a class of obedient, English-educated minor bureaucrats to help your administration, but at the same time, you are planning to do it by teaching Shakespeare, because Shakespeare also brings you legitimacy to your imperial rule and your presence here. That is the story of how Shakespeare entered our imagination, our educational institutions, and our understanding of literature. This is not to deny the very great talents of Shakespeare. This is not to deny the fact that Among all writers in the world, it is Shakespeare who has been the most appropriated writer. All languages, all cultures, all languages, linguistic traditions in the globe have appropriated Shakespeare, have continued their negotiations with Shakespeare all through these centuries. The point that one would like to make here is that this extraordinary, iconic place given to Shakespeare depended on certain notions. And the notion can be described as this, that you can take Shakespeare out from his historical context and treat him as a universally appreciable writer. You do not believe that Shakespeare should be first read and interpreted in the very specific history of his time and his society and his own negotiations with the contradictions and the conflicts of the British society and the Western world during that period. The tendency has been to place Shakespeare in a space which can be called apolitical, ahistorical, where we say that Shakespeare deals with the basic elemental emotions and passions of the human nature, and these have the capacity to transcend the boundaries of nationality and cultural norms, and they can be communicated theatrically. And you treat Shakespeare as probably the most powerful writer who gave representation to the universal features of human nature. This argument has been very strongly accepted by most of the academics and scholars in India. Is that valid? Is that not something that we should be questioning? What do we really mean by universal framework? How right are we in treating Shakespeare as someone who can be abstracted out of his own rootedness in the history of that particular period? These are the questions that we need to take up when we want to understand the relevance of Shakespeare today. Let me explain this with some of the imagined reconstructions of the performances of the play, The Tempest by Shakespeare. In the year 1611, probably the first performance of the play, The Tempest, was organized at the Blackfriar Heritage Building. Harpreet Kaur was talking about the many storms and the tempests inside which Shakespeare's plays had to deal with. And one of these turmoils was that British society experienced the plague epidemic quite frequently during Shakespeare's lifetime. In fact, he lost his beloved son, one of the twins born to William and Anne Hathaway, to the plague. And the plague also not only created huge problems for the dwellers and the residents of London and elsewhere, it also meant the closure of the regular commercial theatres of the time. This could have been one of the reasons why the play, The Tempest, was performed in the very beautiful playing space which was available in one of the halls of Blackfriars. And on the evening, probably, or late afternoon, the play was performed in candlelight. And it was found to be a very entertaining play, beginning with the arranged and organized shipwreck, which brings some of the elites of Milan and Venice and other places to this island, which there are only three people living. Prospero, who has been banished from his own dukedom, who has now established a small colony for himself by using the exotic knowledge he has gathered from reading of the books. And he is the practitioner of what was then popularly known as white magic, as contrasted with the more evil and darker black magic. And he is assisted by a slave whose name is Caliban, which is an anagram for cannibal, one who eats human flesh. And he has his own daughter, Miranda, whom he brought here as a little child and who has been with him for more than 13 years. The spectators and the audience who sat through this performance of the Tempest were watching a dramatic presentation showing them the white civilized individual with his own special acquisition of knowledge, occupying the colony and making the colony a place for himself and his daughter, and treating Caliban, who is obviously the indigenous individual belonging to that island, as not only his slave, but as a primitive, as the other of the European culture and civilization, as an individual who is uneducable, to whom he has taught a language, but who still continues to be disobedient and claiming that the island belongs to him and he should have inherited from his mother, Sycorax, who was a witch and who owned this island. If we try to imaginatively enter into the minds of the audience of that time, we can wonder whether they saw anything anomalous in the whole presentation. Was there any reason to doubt that the island belonged to Caliban? It was his inheritance from his mother. Was he telling a lie? Wasn't his claim a very judicious claim? Hadn't he been turned into, to quote the words of Caliban, instead of being the master and the king of the island, he has now become the only subject, the only ruled, or as we would say in our language today, the only colonized individual. Now, I'm sure the majority of the spectators were not very much disturbed by this anomaly and this contradiction of a white civilized individual usurping what belongs to the primitive, because at that point of time in Western history, people, the natives and the indigenous people who were, quote and unquote, discovered and seen for the first time in these distant islands and continents were constructed, they were reconstructed culturally as the other of Europe. They were the primitive people, the uncivilized people belonging to a barbaric society and civilization. And how could one talk about such a barbarian, being the owner of an island? Probably they did not find much that was anomalous. Fortunately, Shakespeare, when he wrote the manuscript of the play, does not specify the race to which Caliban belongs. But it's very clear that at that point of history known as early modern period, Europe had already developed this notion of the culturally other who should be colonized and who cannot have any claim over resources of the land and the society that belongs to him. Again, I don't think I need to add more number of examples here. It's very clear that Shakespeare instinctively, or maybe by the virtue of being extremely sensitive to all these little waves in Western history by reading, by being a part of the popular culture, by maybe listening to endless stories of voyages and descriptions by the sailors who came to London. Let's remember, he did not belong to the academic world, he belonged to popular culture and popular theater, but he had such an extraordinary sensitivity to all the new things which were just making their presence felt. And I understood that probably behind this unequal relationship between Caliban and Prospero, you have the incipient colonization, which was gradually beginning at that time. It had not yet consolidated itself. It had not become such a very powerful system which could suppress many societies, but the indications were very much there. Let us take a quantum jump from the first performance of the play The Tempest and come to 1950s and 60s. We suddenly find that a new generation in the Caribbean islands begins to ask the question, which is the title of my presentation here. Why should we read Shakespeare? And why should we read Shakespeare also assumes a far more important question. How should we read Shakespeare? Can we continue to read him as only a classic and an iconic figure introduced in our schools and colleges by the imperial regimes of the past? Or is there something else that we can do with Shakespeare? And that leads to what is one of the most vibrant movements of the 20th century. And this movement is something that happens ubiquitously in most of the erstwhile colonies, which begin to interrogate their past, which begin to raise very important questions about the imperial past and the history that they have gone through. And wonder of wonders, they find this iconized writer, Shakespeare, as a very source of raising those questions, as the very repository of all those metaphors and images with which you can raise questions about the Caribbean past, not the past of England, but of Caribbean past. And you have writers like the M.A. Césaire, who adapts the play, rewrites the play, and makes Caliban a rebel, a very conscious rebel, who is fighting against Prospero, who now is made the representative figure of the white imperialism, which unjustly colonized 3/4 of the globe. Look at the appropriation of Shakespeare. The point is, Shakespeare still continues to be the center of the major debates, even in the post-colonial period, but he is now read and interpreted from a very different perspective. And the perspectives, which again I want to come back to a little later, are the following. One, doesn't Shakespeare present in his major plays how this imaginary of the entire globe was categorized into the West and the rest of the world? Doesn't Shakespeare create a space in his plays where we can ask questions about the legitimacy of the so-called civilizing processes associated with the imperialism? Doesn't Shakespeare create enough spaces in his major plots and subplots for the people of the erstwhile colonies who are now in search of a new identity, maybe a hybrid identity, because they can't give up their colonial past altogether. But they have to choose between being an Ariel or a Caliban. They have to choose whether they will continue to look at the white Prospero as a paternalistic, civilizing father figure, or a usurper or a colonialist? And these were the questions which began to be asked from the 1950s and the 60s. One of the most unique things about Shakespeare is reading Shakespeare, interpreting Shakespeare has meant adapting Shakespeare, rewriting Shakespeare, rewriting the plays of Shakespeare to suit the needs of every generation. I don't think I'm making an exaggeration when I say next only to the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, Shakespeare has been the most appropriated writer, and his texts and his plays have been the most appropriated texts anywhere across the globe. This has happened through the reinterpretation and the rewriting, not only through books of criticism or through changes in our pedagogical practices, but more by the creative misreadings of Shakespeare. By creative misreading, I mean not being very puritanically authentic in relation to the original texts of Shakespeare, but exercising your autonomy and freedom to rewrite Shakespeare in your own languages, to rewrite Shakespeare in order to resonate with your own contemporary social and political movements and needs. And that happened not only in the Caribbean islands, it happened in India also. The third sphere of the arrival of Shakespeare I did not mention earlier, because I want to relate it to what has been happening ever since the 1960s and the 70s everywhere in the world, is the way in which Shakespeare was adopted, rewritten, and reformulated, and I would even go to the extent of saying vandalized by the Indian popular theatre. The Parsi theatre, which began to have its sway from the end of the 19th century, and then it had its heydays during the early decades of the 20th century, and which became a model for company theatre, company drama, professional drama all over India, including Karnataka, the state to which I belong. In Parsi theatre, Shakespeare was not an iconic figure or a classic who should not be tampered with. He was only an interesting narrator, storyteller, and creator of powerful characters, and you could do anything that you pleased with him. You could Indianize him, you could localize him, you could give his characters names from your own languages, you could turn and twist the plot the way you wanted. And with this total gay abandon and autonomy, the writers of our popular plays continued to appropriate Shakespeare. It is not happening in our academic world, because in the academic world he remained on a very high pedestal as a great master with whom you cannot take too many liberties, and your translations of Shakespeare should be very authentic, word to word and syllable to syllable. This was the pressure under which the Indian academy, I mean the higher institutions of education worked. In complete contrast to this, there was this endless creative adaptation of appropriation of Shakespeare. And that is where I think one has to look for the answer to the question, why should we read Shakespeare? The answer would be dependent on the question, how do we read Shakespeare? Our popular dramatists in India, especially in the Parsi theatre, they read Shakespeare as nothing but a repository of stories and narratives with powerful scenes. And they, very energetically naturalized Shakespeare and then made use of him for their own kind of drama, which was extremely melodramatic and full of passionate murders and intrigues and loud dialogues, etc., etc., and also including songs, and then the whole paraphernalia of the stagecraft brought in by the Parsi theatre, and other forms of commercial theatre. This happened way back during the colonial period and repeated itself in a very different way in the 1950s and the 1960s. In the 1960s, to be precise, around 1964, you have one more important phase in which India made very new negotiation with Shakespearean theatre. And this refers to the activities of the People's Theatre in India and the activities associated with the left-oriented theatrical groups like IPTA and other dramatic troupes. These were very new experiments. And once again, what happens is Shakespeare is still very much centrally there. And it is the plays of Shakespeare which are now used in order to talk about the contemporary politics. And that was the politics of the past Nazism and fascism, which the world had witnessed, and also about the colonial experience. So once again, you have a rereading of Shakespeare. And if the question, why should we read Shakespeare, had been asked during this decade, I'm sure the answer is we should read Shakespeare because a central part of his writings metaphorically and symbolically resonates with our contemporary experience. And the contemporary experience in the 1960s was of a post-colonial nation trying to grapple with problems, social, religious, and political, also being under the long shadow of a very violent partition, and now seeing that political freedom has not brought the equality of the classes, and increasing poverty, and then all the ills that go with poverty and illiteracy. And you have a whole group of progressive writers and performers, and also groups of theatrical performers who now do two things. One is to make Shakespeare relevant to that decade, to go back to the plays of Shakespeare, and in the performance and also in the subtle and not so subtle changes you make in the original, you try to relate Shakespeare and make him speak very, very powerfully and resonantly. The other thing they do is, like the dramatists of the colonial period, here also there is an attempt to bring in the indigenous theatre and the indigenous performing traditions in order to perform Shakespeare. For example, the great Utpal Dutt during this decade used the Jatra folk tradition of Bengal and started performing Shakespearean plays in Bangla, in the language of the land, and also used all the elements of the very popular folksy kind of tradition associated with the Jatra. A little later, maybe a decade and a half later, you have the great Kannada theatre personality V.V. Karanth using the Yakshagana tradition here in Karnataka in order to perform Shakespeare's Macbeth. And such a thing has happened in all parts of India from then onwards. Let us now come to the present.
Chenni sir, you are muted. Chenni sir, you are muted.
Am I audible now? Am I audible now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
So I was speaking about the very contemporary context in which we are discussing Shakespeare today, and trying to raise this question: why read Shakespeare, and how do we read Shakespeare? I think it is no longer tenable to argue that we read Shakespeare only because he's a great wordsmith and a very great artist. It is no longer tenable to argue that Shakespeare presents to us the unchanging, eternal elements of human nature. What then does he do to us? I'll go back to the beautiful lines quoted by Dr. Harpreet Kaur, where you have to balance the storm inside with the calm outside. Now, this, I think, should provide us with a very, very useful metaphor for why we should be reading Shakespeare. If we read Shakespeare from the ethos of our present political and social condition, we discover that there are many things which we can find a source for in Shakespeare. I'll just give you a list, hoping that we can take it up during the discussion. One of the most important questions that Shakespeare raised in his major plays was the nature of power. What is the nature of power? How is power created in societies? How is it that people become subservient and subjugated to power? What are the events of power? Why is it that power becomes, even in a monarchy, which Shakespeare had seen in early modern West, where even the most powerful monarch had to make negotiations with the powerful class of the aristocrats and the barons, etc. And political success was always so very uncertain in Shakespeare's time. And therefore, from his own sensitive understanding of the politics of that period, Shakespeare raises fundamental questions about how, in a society of different classes, of different groups of people, and basically divided into the powerful and the powerless, the rich and the poor, the working class, who were spectators of his plays, known as groundlings, and those who ruled. Now, in such a social world, how is it that hegemony is created? Power is created for a particular class. And how is it that a particular individual becomes a tyrant? I'm using this word, borrowing from the title of a very fine book on Shakespeare by Stephen Greenblatt, entitled Tyrant. And the argument of Stephen Greenblatt, the father figure of the new historicism, is that in play after play, Shakespeare examines not only the autocratic personalities which emerge with these changes in the power structure, and also the imbalances and the threats to human society, and also the distortions which happen to human nature because of the accumulation of power. This he examines in a play like Coriolanus, where the great Roman warrior who could have protected his motherland switches over his loyalty to the enemy because he does not want to yield to the demands of the populace in his own country. And therefore, he reformulates himself into a power-hungry, authoritarian figure who has no conscience and who can make an attack, a military attack on his own homeland. Shakespeare examines this in Julius Caesar, where there was some kind of a skeletal structure, not a perfect one at all, but at least a skeletal structure of triumvirates representing the common people, and the common people who had no votes and no participation in the administration, but at least they were part of a republic. And how is it that someone by his military valor becomes an iconic figure and a legend in his own lifetime, Julius Caesar? And how is it that the populace, by becoming worshippers of his charismatic personality, are ready to sacrifice the republican ideals themselves? and how they are ready in order to create a person of this enormous power who will definitely trample upon both equality and the freedom of the common people. One can examine a play. I already mentioned the Tempest, where one can see a very prescient prophetic understanding of the nature of colonialism. And this is important to us because right now we are going through a phase which is generally described as the phase of globalization, which should be properly named as neo-colonialism, with the neoliberal policies and then the things that you experience every day. So when there are these problems, sorry, am I audible? Do I have a problem here? Hello?
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir.
You are audible.
I'll continue. So I was saying that in very different forms, colonialism is still with us in a new avatar. And in order to understand this, we need to reread Shakespeare. For example, Poonam Trivedi, who has done excellent work on reception of Shakespeare in India, she has recorded that when she visited Shakespeare festivals in some of the very well-known engineering and technological institutions, she found that the students there were performing Julius Caesar in a very contemporary fashion by making the protagonist not Julius Caesar but CEO of a multinational company. And then the political struggle in Julius Caesar in Shakespeare is now turned into a very competitive struggle among those who want to have their own share of power in the global marketing complex. This is what I meant by appropriation and rereading, and therefore it is the young readers today, the creative minds today, who are miraculously repeating what their ancestors had done during the colonial period. That is, take Shakespeare, use him, appropriate him, rewrite him, perform him again in a contemporary nuance, so that you can talk about what you are going through. It's a different kind of global structure of power, which is again doing harm to many of the local societies. And you can read this historical phenomenon of the present world by going back to Shakespeare, by rewriting him. This is what the young minds are doing here. And if I can mention the way in which Indian films are now appropriating Shakespeare, let's not forget that Shakespeare was fully 100% part of popular culture. Though, of course, there was no such hard and fast categorization of mainstream and popular during the period of Shakespeare. So now it is the most powerful medium of our modern urban popular culture, the film, which is appropriating Shakespeare. You are all familiar with the three films made by Vishal Bharadwaj, Onkara, Haider, etc. And those are exactly on the model of how Shakespeare has been read and interpreted all over the world. In one of these films, the location is today's Kashmir, with all its problems and conflicts and struggles. In another, it is the Bombay underworld, and the world of Shakespeare's plays took cognizance of this violence, took cognizance of the fact that there were intrigues, there were murders, there were planned killings, etc., etc., even under the so-called peaceful regime of Queen Elizabeth, not to speak of the later Jacobean period. So this is what one can read in Shakespeare today. Apart from these the political conditions, the global unequal economic structure of power. There is something in Shakespeare resonating with what we are going through at present. As one of the great Caribbean critics said, very prophetically, Shakespeare wrote about a possible future, and the possible future he imagined has become our present. That has become our contemporary reality. And the same could be said about many societies, including the Indian society. Therefore, it's not that we should be constantly and feverishly trying to politicize the Shakespeare. I don't think there are many advantages, especially to teachers. What we should be doing is to introduce students to these elements in his plays, which have something to do with our own lives, our own social worlds. And students should, at some point or the other, ask those questions. Even while reading, they should ask the question: why are we reading Shakespeare? Does it allow me, help me, enable me to relate better, understand better my own circumstances? And my feeling is it does. It really does. This is true of all great classics. The last comment I want to make is maybe because many of us, at least teachers, English teachers belonging to my generation, were brought up on the principles, educated rather, on the principles of the new criticism. We tended to take a very textualist view of literature. Our approach to Shakespeare was to read a Shakespearean text and make a verbal analysis, textual analysis, a word-by-word analysis, and offer an exegesis, explanation to our students. But with the development of many other models of reading, especially with the new historicism, with post-colonial studies, we were able to historicize Shakespeare. We are now able to see all those institutional practices, theatrical conventions, historical events of the time. And Shakespeare's greatness was that most sensitively, intuitively, he responded to these subtle changes and found dramatic representations, dramatic images for communicating that experience, and therefore we need to read Shakespeare. So, dear friends, I am sure I have exceeded the time that was given to me, but I thought I could be sharing these with fellow teachers. Once again, let me thank you for giving me a patient listening, and I would be very happy to participate in discussion with the teacher participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Over to Harpreet Kaur.
Okay, thank you, sir. I really appreciate for your wonderful explanation and of how Shakespeare is relevant today with many classic examples: Macbeth, Julius Caesar, the beautiful play Tempest, and the powerful characters of Prospero, Miranda, who teach us much more about the modern human condition. And you discussed on the contemporary context, why should we read Shakespeare? And Shakespeare is an iconic figure, and you told his unique features, his greatness, and Shakespeare still continues to be the center of debate in this post-colonial period. I believe that your discussion was very wonderful. Your enlightening thoughts and presentation was amazing. Now it's a time for Q&A session. So I would like to request all the participants, whoever wants to put the question for a question and answer session with the resource person, Professor Rajendra Chenni.
Ma'am, can I ask, Harpreet ma'am?
Yes,
Yes,
carry
ma'am,
on.
sure.
Sir, thank you so much, sir, for providing such a good lecture. And your lecture was very informative. Thank you so much. Sir, I just want to discuss with you about David Williamson's Dead White Male. Have you read that? Dead White Male by Australian playwright David
Yes, yes.
Williamson. Sir, that is a very fine example of Shakespeare in the contemporary scenario. The title itself, Dead White Male, is Shakespeare himself. And that drama is a very fine example of intertextuality and how we can use, how can we interpret Shakespeare in the contemporary scenario. Sir, I taught that play to my PG student, and I came to know that how what is the significance of Shakespeare and for a scholar, for an author. Sir, I want you to discuss on this, please. What are
I'm
your
glad you mentioned one very important play, which, to quote another critic, adopts this complex perspective of both reverence and critique. Reverence in the sense you still take Shakespeare as an iconic figure, central, or maybe because of the historical circumstances, played a very authoritative role, but you also critique him and critique the entire master culture and the master discourses which he represents. And this has happened in most of the literary traditions. For example, the great Canadian novelist, when she was asked to make use of Shakespeare and write maybe a work of fiction, she did that, and she did exactly what I was trying to summarize during the concluding part of my talk, where the locale and the social ambience is very contemporary and very modern, and the elements of Shakespeare's drama are used in order to interpret this. But it is not just interpretation; it's also critique. Very self-consciously, you are now aware that Shakespeare came to you as part of a package. He came to us as a part of the imperial package. That doesn't in any way take away his greatness, but you have to be interrogating. You have to be asking those questions, and you should also be seeing how, whether consciously or unconsciously, some things and some persons are marginalized in the plays themselves. You see how they get marginalized. For example, in a play like Othello, in a play like Hamlet, what happens to the women figures there? Why is it that Ophelia, who is actually a victim of the patriarchy at home, a brother and a father, trying to, preach her and trying to transform her into a very, conformist sort of a person. And Hamlet, who offers a very different kind of adventure to her. Why is it that she just has to be given a floral tribute and made to commit suicide and disappear? Those are the questions that we need to be asking. On the one hand, what gets marginalized in Shakespeare's plays themselves? And then secondly, from our perspective, from our contemporary perspective, aren't we able to see the importance of this as well as the weaknesses? What gets
Yes,
lost?
David Williamson has presented both the discourse. He has support in the form of Angela Judd, who is very much inspired by Shakespeare, and a professor who is against Shakespeare. So thank you so much, sir.
May I ask? This is Nilanjana Pathak.
Yes, ma'am, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. Dr. Chennai, this was perhaps the most enlightening talk I've ever heard on Shakespeare. And my question is, sir, we are living almost 5 centuries after Shakespeare. So is it possible that when we dramatize or when we stage the plays of Shakespeare, do you think that we can recreate the magic of those 455, what was there 455 years back? I mean, in terms of culture, costume, etc., can there be some adaptations to contemporary times? Or, in your weighty opinion, would that take away from the essence of the play? But I feel that perhaps the plays may become more realistic and the audiences may be able to resonate better if we adapt them to contemporary times. But do you think that would take away the essence of the plays, sir? Your opinion, please.
That's an excellent question. This has been debated very vigorously. One question which has been recently raised by many critics who belong to a post-colonial period, and they accuse the post-colonial critics of giving anachronistic readings of Shakespeare. Anachronistic is Shakespeare belonged to the early modern period. And why is it that you want to carry the baggage of your present experience and then enforce it on a Shakespearean play through your interpretations? But then the other side of critics has argued that, see, all reading is anachronistic. I can't become a contemporary reader of Shakespeare. I am a 21st century reader of Shakespeare, and my perspective is colored by my existence in the contemporary world. Therefore, that is one part of the theoretical debate. The other one that you are asking is, would the essence of the play be lost, with the experimentation or with trying to contemporize the play altogether? Now, it's a speculative question, but an important question. It is for the individual director to decide, the one who produces the play to decide to what extent the core of Shakespeare would be retained. The costume may be modern, the ambience may be modern, but there is something like the core, something that Shakespeare wanted to communicate. I think that needs to be retained, and that again is a decision which has to be taken by the one who produces and directs the. So it's not a question of the essence being lost, but maybe there is a point of balance where you retain some of the core elements of the play, but you also adapt it to meet your requirements of the present.
Thank
Can
you,
I
sir. My
ask a
question is answered. Thank you.
Yes,
Sir,
yes.
can I put a question? Sir,
Yes.
I'm Dr. Neerja Sachdev, and what Nilanjana had just said just now, I totally agree with her that in the perspectives of costumes and everything, naturally will we be able to do justice to the plays of Shakespeare. But I'm just, I'm not putting a question, but I'm just stating that one of the persons, an elderly person, he is an IITian. And he put up this question to me, that why do we spend time in reading Shakespeare these days? Everything has become so globalized and digitalized. So why are we reading Shakespeare today? So I contradicted him and said, yes, very well, we are reading Shakespeare today because all the most important thing, leaving aside the costumes and the scenic presentation, what is more important is that all the characters that are there in the plays of Shakespeare are very much prevalent around us. We find them everywhere. We find Macbeth everywhere. We find persons like Cordelia. We find people, indecisive persons like Hamlet everywhere around us. So it is Shakespeare presented his characters not only for his own time, but in fact, whosoever those characters are, the ordinary characters with ordinary faults and defaults. I mean, you can say, and ambitions. And that is why they are very much related to the present time and why we keep reading Shakespeare. Sir, do you agree with my point as I was trying to contradict that fellow?
Yes, certainly. In the sense, digitization and global technologies, they do not make Shakespeare irrelevant. And my own intuitive feeling is they make Shakespeare more relevant because those who may not have the patience to sit through a performance or read from one end of the book to the other, they can now listen, to audiobooks. They have graphic novels, if they are young, graphic novels, extremely well done based on Shakespearean plays. They have many kinds of animated productions and presentations today. That's one part of it, in the sense you can experience Shakespeare today probably in a better way than we used to, sticking only
Yes.
to the printed page. And secondly, about what should I say, the constant discovery that we feel while watching or reading Shakespeare, that this character, he resembles somebody
Yes.
and you identify, and that's why I was trying to mention the autocratic figures. Almost in three-fourths of the world today, you have very autocratic regimes which are not very happy with the democratic structures. Now, what should the people of the three-fourths or half of the world feel today? Don't you think they feel that many protagonists of Shakespeare, they symbolize for them something which may not have been a reality. It was, in my view. It may not have been the same kind of reality, but now you feel that there are resemblances.
Yes.
That's why we need to read Shakespeare.
Thank you so much.
For the comment.
Any more questions?
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Hello.
Yes,
sir.
please.
Yeah. It's Venkatesh. Sir, it's Venkatesh from Udupi.
Tell me, Venkatesh.
Sir, good afternoon, sir. Very good afternoon. Sir, first of all, I want to express my opinion regarding this speech. Your speech is like intellectual tempest that helps to chide the passiveness that is created by this pandemic situation. So that my question is, sir, Shakespearean text is for two kinds of spectators, like literate spectators and illiterate that spectators. My question is related to Hamlet. How can that Shakespeare that reach his thoughts to both worlds of these spectators?
One of the answers I can give is, if you go back to the theatrical world of Shakespeare, with the Globe Theatre and other competing professional theatres, as well as private performances which were patronized by the aristocrats and sometimes by the royalty itself, you will see that the only way theatre could exist at that time was to reach out to all classes, because this was the single most powerful means of entertainment and also a meeting ground for the entire civil society. There was nothing that could replace the theatre during this period, you see. And therefore, anybody who wrote for the theatre and wanted to be a successful dramatist had to write in such a way that it would have something for the very literate audience and something also for the so-called general audience. I'm not denigrating them. They were probably the most intense spectators of Shakespearean drama. And that's the reason why Shakespearean plays are so open-ended and they are so hybrid. I use the word hybrid in a very positive way, because you have the highest lyricism and dense poetry in a play, but you also have slapstick comedy, you have farce, you have innuendo and double meanings and all that. So that kind of structure, which was part of the theatrical world of Shakespeare, I think has made his plays stride across the two worlds of the academic and the scholarly and the popular entertainment world. I would say the nearest parallel, if you want to point it out to your students, would be the film world in India. How it has also, I'm not talking only about the highly commercialized forms of film. I'm talking about the middle cinema, the experimental, not just the artistic, but the middle cinema, which also reached out to various sections of Indian society. Thank you for the comment.
Yeah, Harpreet. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Dr. Harpreet.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So Professor Chenni, sir, Professor Chenni sir has answered all the questions very well, and I feel he has satisfied all the queries. Now, it's a great honor to invite Professor Mrinal Srivastav, who is chairing this session. Professor Mrinal Srivastav has been teaching English literature in the Department of English, APS University, Riva, since the last almost 3 decades. Her areas of interest include Indian English writings, women's studies, British fiction, etc. She has presented several research papers in national and international conferences. 15 candidates have been awarded PhD under her supervision. Thank you, Srivastav ma'am, for gracing this event. I welcome you to remark on today's session.
A warm good afternoon to all of you. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
A warm good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much, Professor Chenni, for such an enlightening lecture, for such a delightful lecture. And I thank ISPEL and I thank Professor Ghansham for giving me this opportunity of chairing this session in which such a great lecture was delivered by the erudite scholar, Professor Rajendra Chenni. Shakespeare has been there endlessly since the beginning of English studies. Shakespeare has been there as a part and parcel of English studies, as a part and parcel of the syllabus wherever English is being taught. Why should we read Shakespeare today? The question, so pertinent question, which was the topic of Chenni sir's lecture, and which was answered in such a delightful way through his lecture. Shakespeare, we all know, we all have been, teaching him, we all have been reading him, we all have been studying him, and there have been so many reasons why you feel that Shakespeare must be a part of English syllabi everywhere. His characters, his themes, the way he has written his plays, his plot structures, the universal feelings and emotions, memorable characters, everything about his plays, we accept, we study, we accept, we have kept him on a pedestal, and we think of him as he is one of the greatest dramatists. We accept that. But how is Shakespeare relevant today? Why should we read him today? How can we contemporize Shakespeare, and how can we look at him through the new lenses that Professor Chenni has recently provided? In every century, there have been people who have read Shakespeare, who have opined, who have reinterpreted Shakespeare in their own way. And for us Indians, the Indian students, and the Indian faculty who have been teaching Shakespeare since so long, this is a new way of looking at Shakespeare. And as part of post-colonial studies, how Shakespeare can be studied, how we can look at Shakespeare, how the plays of Shakespeare can be reinterpreted in this way. Professor Chenni has so aptly pointed out the various aspects of Shakespeare's plays through which we can view our own contemporary scenario. His characters reside everywhere, like one of the participants just now pointed out. His characters reside everywhere around us. But today, unfortunately, when the spate of suicides by younger people has unfortunately risen, the lines of Hamlet, to be or not to be, do come to the mind. Today, the youngsters, they do not even have the time to reflect, to be or not to be? That is the question. They just take the plunge and woof, they are gone. Read Shakespeare, understand Shakespeare. I would urge the young students and even the young teachers to please read the texts of Shakespeare, try to understand and try to bring Shakespeare more closer to our own scenario, to our own environment, to our own culture. Today's session has been an extremely fruitful one. I thank Professor Chenni for enlightening us in such a manner and for giving us a new way to look at Shakespeare. I thank all the participants. I thank the participants who have put such brilliant questions and the way Chenni sir has answered them. I thank you all once again. It was a delightful session. And I thank ISPEL and Professor Ghanshyam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Professor Chenni, sir. And on behalf of ISPEL, I'm just presenting a token of gratitude to Professor Chenni, sir, because I believe this is one of the best lectures I have ever attended in my life as far as Shakespeare is concerned. So, Chenni, sir, with a great deal of respect, I present this certificate to Professor Chenni, sir. Can you see it?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Sir, this is our gratitude to you on behalf of ISPEL, because that was such an excellent lecture, and we are using the free version of Google Meet. So we provided seats to only 100 participants, but we have recorded it, and we are creating the channel of ISPEL YouTube channel, wherein we are sharing this video of yours for the benefit of the fraternity and the students, sir. So thank you very much.
Ghanshyam, you can treat me as a member of ISPEL.
Thank you very much, sir. That's an honor for us. Honor for us. And this is also the certificate to our chairperson, Dr. Mrinal Srivastav,
Thank you so much,
Riva, for chairing this wonderful session of Professor Chenni and presenting your remarks. And this is the certificate to Dr. Harpreet Kaur for being the master of ceremonies for this particular program. So over to Harpreet Kaur for vote of thanks.